Welcome to this explainer. When we think of archaeology, it's easy to picture a Hollywood movie, dashing explorers dodging boulder traps. But today, we're going to ditch the romantic treasure hunting and look at what is essentially CSI antiquity. It's a meticulous, scientific process of piecing together the ancient world from the absolute faintest of clues. So here's our roadmap for today. We've got 4 critical phases to cover. First, the 10% puzzle. Second, clues in the clay. Third, anatomy of a dig. And finally, limits of the lens. Let's get right to it.
All right, section 1, the 10% puzzle.
When we actually dig into the Earth, we're faced with this stark reality about how little data we're really working with. Dr. Jeffrey Hudon hit the nail on the head when he said, archaeology is like a puzzle, trying to put a puzzle together with 90% of the pieces missing. I mean, think about that, a 90% handicap right out of the gate. And that's simply because organic stuff, wood, parchment, leather, cloth, it just doesn't survive the centuries. Unless, of course, it happens to be deposited in some incredibly unique, super dry desert environment, kind of like where they found the Dead Sea Scrolls. But usually, excavators are forced to deduce this entire ancient world from just a tiny, resilient fraction of what was left behind.
And honestly, this brilliantly illustrates why there's such a massive difference between Old Testament and New Testament archaeology. Old Testament archaeology deals with massive empires, huge building programs, epic physical destructions, stuff that really leaves a mark. But the New Testament? That began mostly as a grassroots spiritual and religious movement within Judaism. It is so much harder to trace physically. Early spiritual movements just don't leave behind the same tangible physical footprint as, say, a towering royal palace or a fortress that was burned to the ground.
So what actually does survive the test of time? Well, we're basically left relying on the indestructible stuff. We're talking everyday durable items, pottery used for storage and cooking, metal that was hammered into nails, weapons, or tools, stone that was used for grinding grain or slinging in battle. And then later on, we get coins, which start popping up around the 7th century BC. These resilient items, they are literally the heavy lifters when it comes to piecing together that remaining 10% of our puzzle.
Which brings us to section 2, clues in the clay.
Okay, so the absolute most abundant artifact you're going to find on any dig is pottery, but before we even get into examining the shape or the style of the clay itself, we have to look for what's written on it. You see, in the ancient world, broken pieces of pottery were basically used as scrap paper. We call these ostraca. They give us epigraphic material, which is really just a formal way of saying ancient dispatches written in ink directly onto the ceramic. A mind-blowing example of this would be the famous Lachish letters. These are priceless, direct snapshots of desperate military dispatches, literally begging for information right before Jerusalem fell to Babylon. I mean, reading them connects the ancient writer directly to us, right across the centuries. It's absolutely fascinating.
Now, I love this analogy. Consider how Dr. Hudon compares dating pottery to dating cars. Just as you can instantly tell a 1964 Ford Mustang from a 2023 model just by looking at its styling, even though they do the exact same basic thing and have the same basic parts, an expert can date a broken pot shard to within 50 to 100 years, based purely on its evolving stylistic forms. So even without a date stamped on the bottom, these changing artistic styles serve as a remarkably accurate clock.
But beyond just giving us a date, this indestructible ceramic trash is literally the ultimate historical informant. It reveals the ethnicity and cultural identity of the people who lived there, because different groups utilized entirely different shapes and decorations. It shows us their level of economic prosperity. It even gives us hard evidence of international trade routes. Scientists can use something called neutron activation analysis to trace the exact origin of the clay itself. This means they can prove a pot found in one country was actually manufactured hundreds of miles away. It completely proves that ancient supply chains were way more global than you might think.
And just to really drive that prosperity point home, take a look here. Notice the heavy, highly utilitarian, unpainted Israelite pottery from Shiloh on the left. That was made strictly to keep body and soul together. It's all about survival. Now, sharply contrast that with the beautifully painted, super refined Philistine Mycenaean-style pottery over on the right. This stark difference tells us so much. It indicates a much more economically advanced artisan class in that Philistine culture, people who actually had the time and the resources to prioritize artistic beauty over just pure survival.
Moving on to section 3, anatomy of a dig. Here's the thing. Archaeology is actually a destructive science. Once you excavate a site, you can never do it again. So, knowing how to carefully extract this fragile data is absolutely crucial. You can't just show up on your summer vacation with a hardware store shovel and start digging holes. Modern archaeology requires a highly structured, multidisciplinary approach.
First, you've got to formulate a rigorous research design. Then, you have to secure antiquities permits from regional authorities. And let me tell you, those are heavily regulated and very, very expensive. From there, you're raising finances, affiliating with academic institutions, and recruiting an expert multidisciplinary staff. The sheer logistics involved before a single grain of sand is moved, it's monumental.
When excavators do finally get to start digging, they're often digging into what is known as a tell. Now, a tell is essentially an artificial mound. It's made up of ancient, superimposed cities that have been destroyed and rebuilt over centuries. So people would build a city, right? Then it gets destroyed by fire or an invading army, and the next generation would simply smooth over the rubble and build their new city directly on top of it. It's literally a layer cake of human history.
I mean, just look at the sheer verticality of Beit Shan right here. This mound contains up to 30 superimposed cities, layered over thousands of years. It's incredible. But to actually make sense of this, archaeologists obviously don't just bulldoze the hill. They dig in these precise 5 by 5 meter squares, and they leave standing dirt borders between them called bulks. These walls of dirt are left completely intact so researchers can carefully control and preserve this complex vertical timeline. It lets them physically see the strata of time cut right into the earth.
Now, on the flip side, you have what's known as a khirbet, or a horvat. This is a shallow ruin or site that only existed for a very short time, so it has very little stratigraphy. But while it might not have the dramatic, towering depth of a tell, a khirbet is incredibly valuable. Why? Because it offers this pristine, uncontaminated horizontal snapshot of one very specific era. It's totally untouched and uncorrupted by later builders.
So, through the painstaking work of scholars who are constantly synchronizing calendars and chronologies, like resolving all the conflicting dating systems of ancient regional kingdoms, excavators can actually peg their findings to distinct eras. This creates a really reliable backbone of history. It lets researchers logically map out periods, moving all the way from the Middle Bronze Age of the Patriarchs to the Late Bronze Age of the Exodus, right through the Iron Age settlement, and finally up to the era of the monarchy.
All right, let's wrap up with Section 4, Limits of the Lens.
As much as we love this science, it is vital to recognize what archaeology can and cannot do. Because interpretation is inherently subjective, the discipline is deeply vulnerable to severe abuses. And we see this across the board. It ranges from extremists and treasure hunters physically looting and destroying sites to the manipulation of data just to back up modern nationalistic claims. It also includes something called archaeological eisegesis. This happens when individuals, coming from any perspective really, force the physical evidence to fit their preconceived theological or ideological views, rather than just taking a step back and letting the artifacts speak for themselves.
Which naturally leads us to ask a highly debated and honestly probably the most frequently asked question in this entire field. Can a shovel and a sifting screen definitively prove the biblical text?
Well, the objective reality is that archaeology's primary role is to substantiate and provide context for the ancient world. It usually shows that an event certainly could have happened, rather than definitively 100% proving that it did. For example, finding ancient pictographs of camels out in the Sinai Peninsula demonstrates that people in patriarchal times did indeed use camels. This pushes back against critics who claim the text was historically inaccurate on that specific detail. So it affirms the setting and the plausibility, but it doesn't prove the specific existence of a single named individual. Let's end with a really fascinating thought experiment. Imagine a 19th century log chapel. It gets completely dismantled and then rebuilt in the late 20th century. But this time, they give it a modern concrete floor, modern windows, and they wire it for electricity. Now imagine future archaeologists excavate this site 500 years from now, and they have absolutely no written records to rely on. How on earth would they accurately interpret its layered history? They'd be looking at 19th century timber sitting directly on top of late 20th century coins and concrete. Without historical text to guide them, unraveling that puzzle correctly would be almost impossible.
It's a really stark reminder for us. While this science provides incredibly powerful, paradigm-shifting clues, our ability to interpret the past is inherently limited. It's an ongoing invitation for us to keep exploring, to rigorously maintain our objectivity, and to listen carefully to the stones. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I'll leave you with this to chew on. What completely mind-blowing piece of history do you think might still be lying just a few feet beneath the earth, right now, just waiting to be discovered?